January 17th, 1945. A bitter wind cut through the streets of Berlin, rattling the half-shuttered windows of a makeshift screening hall tucked behind the Reich Chancellery. Inside, a handful of female German officers entered in stiff, dark uniforms, boots clicking against the cold wooden floor. The room smelled faintly of ink, film stock, and damp wool. Rows of chairs sat empty, save for the few officers whose posture betrayed both pride and unease. On a makeshift screen, the projector hummed to life, whirring and flickering. The light cast sharp, wavering shadows on the walls, painting the women's faces in stark contrasts of determination and tension. The first frames rolled, Allied tanks rolling across shattered towns, soldiers raising flags over conquered positions, and bombed-out streets teeming with survivors. Gasps were almost silent, but the faces told everything. Eyes widened, lips pressed tightly, a hand trembled as it hovered over the side of a chair. Humiliation was subtle at first, a creeping frost, then unmistakable as the reality of German defeat struck in vivid images. For the women, trained to command, to hold authority in uniform, this was a quiet but shattering moment. The war outside their control laid bare on the flickering screen. The scenes they watched would change everything about how they saw the war. By early 1945, Germany's war effort was unraveling. The Western Allies had crossed the Rhine, sweeping through the Rhineland with mechanized precision, while the Soviet Red Army pressed relentlessly from the east. Cities were being reduced to rubble, supply lines severed, and the Luftwaffe, once a symbol of German air power, was a shadow of its former self. Morale among frontline troops and administrative officers alike had begun to erode, yet many in the heart of the Reich clung to an official narrative of defiance, carefully maintained by propaganda and censored media. Women in the German military hierarchy occupied a peculiar, often overlooked position. While barred from frontline combat, many served as officers in auxiliary branches such as the Luftwaffe's administrative corps, communications units, and air raid coordination offices. They oversaw critical functions, managing personnel, relaying intelligence, coordinating logistics, and ensuring the day-to-day functioning of military infrastructure. In theory, these roles gave them authority within their spheres, yet their influence was bounded by the rigid military hierarchy and the gendered assumptions of the time. They were expected to maintain discipline, enforce orders, and uphold the image of the Reich, even as the war increasingly turned against them. The German propaganda machine was both omnipresent and increasingly desperate. Newsreels, posters, radio broadcasts, and newspapers were meticulously curated to sustain a narrative of victory, or at least strategic stalemate. In cities and garrisons, film screenings were routine. Officers and soldiers alike would gather in dimly lit halls to view reels produced by the Wehrmacht and the Ministry of Propaganda, illustrating supposed triumphs on distant fronts or heroic defenses against overwhelming odds. These screenings were intended to bolster morale, to remind viewers that even in retreat, German resolve remained unbroken. Yet by 1945, reality was outpacing narrative. Allied forces had developed unprecedented coordination between air and ground units, combining overwhelming firepower with advanced intelligence and logistical support. The liberation of France, the push through Belgium and the Netherlands, and the relentless Soviet advance into Poland had demonstrated the Reich's inability to resist sustained offensive operations. For officers accustomed to discipline and control, the disconnect between what they were taught to believe and the truth on the battlefield was profound. Within this environment, German female officers were not immune. Their professional pride hinged on competence, authority, and the ability to manage operations efficiently. But morale was not just an abstract concept. It was deeply personal. To see the collapse of German positions on film, in vivid, undeniable imagery, was to confront a failure they could neither command nor correct. The newsreels presented not just military setbacks, but a challenge to their identity and authority. The psychological context was equally significant. Germany had long invested in portraying the war as a collective struggle of disciplined, heroic citizens and soldiers, where every individual had a role and every contribution mattered. Female officers were both enforcers and symbols of that system. Disciplined, competent, and loyal. They were expected to maintain composure, to exemplify resilience. Yet when confronted with footage of cities falling, bridges destroyed, and troops surrendering en masse, the carefully constructed facade began to crumble. The images did not require interpretation. Their message was stark, immediate, and humiliating. This backdrop, the convergence of military collapse, the shifting front lines, and the rigid expectations placed upon female officers, set the stage for the moment captured in the screening hall. Each officer had witnessed German propaganda throughout the war. Each had internalized the narrative of control, competence, and inevitability. And yet, in that room, facing the stark reality of Allied victories, the lines between professional duty and personal reckoning blurred. The coming section will explore the specific campaigns and battles being displayed in the newsreels, the methods of Allied media dissemination, and the direct implications for the officers' perceptions of the war. It is here, in the interplay between fact and presentation, that the full weight of humiliation began to take shape. The newsreels shown to German officers in early 1945 were not abstract reports. They were carefully filmed depictions of precise, tangible military events. In the West, Allied armies had crossed the Rhine, capturing Cologne in March 1945, while mechanized units tore through the Ruhr Valley, encircling thousands of German troops. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Vistula-Oder offensive had swept through Poland and eastern Germany, capturing cities like Breslau and advancing toward Berlin itself. Each frame of these reels documented not propaganda, but undeniable fact: the Reich was collapsing. Newsreels were compiled from frontline footage, reconnaissance reports, and Allied press units. They combined static shots of devastated urban centers with moving images of tanks advancing, infantry marching, and flags being raised over conquered positions. For German viewers, particularly officers accustomed to official narratives of tactical competence and strategic control, the experience was jarring. The contrast between what they had been told, the steady, heroic struggle of German forces, and what they now saw could not have been starker. Female German officers, particularly those in administrative or auxiliary roles, were trained to manage, to oversee, and to enforce. They were expected to maintain composure, to inspire confidence, and to act decisively within their domains. In a war increasingly defined by chaos, unpredictability, and loss, their authority was suddenly undermined not by a failure of personal competence, but by the sheer momentum of the Allied advance. The newsreels confronted them with a truth that no amount of paperwork, personnel management, or internal discipline could alter. Some reels highlighted the destruction of German industrial centers, showing bombed factories and flattened housing blocks, while others focused on frontline surrender. Soldiers who had been presented as invincible in official propaganda were now depicted retreating, surrendering, or fleeing. For the officers, these images were more than tactical updates. They were a direct affront to the professional pride and sense of control they had cultivated over years of service. Their understanding of the war's trajectory, once mediated through layers of controlled information, was suddenly unfiltered, raw, and undeniable. The psychological impact was compounded by the medium itself. Unlike written reports, film imposed immediacy. The flickering images, the motion of troops and vehicles, the sound of distant artillery captured on film, created a visceral experience. Officers could no longer abstract the conflict. They were forced to confront it with all senses engaged. The humiliation was slow-burning, subtle, yet profound, a realization that German claims of strategic competence were increasingly hollow. It is important to contextualize this not merely as a moment of personal shock, but as a reflection of the broader collapse in German command structures. Across the Reich, units were being cut off, communication lines severed, and civilian populations subjected to bombardment and occupation. The newsreels mirrored reality with a brutal fidelity, underscoring the futility of clinging to pride in a war that had already passed its tipping point. By mid-January, Allied advances had rendered the German military situation almost untenable. In the West, the Allies prepared for final pushes into the heart of Germany. In the East, Soviet forces were converging on Berlin. For female officers, the newsreels were not abstract displays. They were an inescapable window into a military and political reality over which they had no influence. They were being forced to witness the erosion of authority they had exercised for years, the very authority that had defined their roles and identities within the Reich. This collision between reality and expectation, between authority and helplessness, set the stage for the reactions captured in the screening hall. The officers were confronted with an unvarnished truth. The Allied advance was unstoppable. German defeat was imminent, and their positions, so carefully maintained, were no longer secure. Each frame of the newsreel chipped away at the carefully constructed facade of control, leaving behind a sense of humiliation and helplessness that would resonate far beyond the screening room. The next section will examine these events from multiple perspectives, exploring human, tactical, technological, and leadership angles to fully understand the weight of this moment. The first angle to consider is human, the immediate psychological impact on the female officers as they watched the Allied victories unfold. Their training emphasized discipline, control, and authority, yet the images on the screen confronted them with a stark reality. The war they had been managing from offices and command posts was slipping beyond German control. Faces, once composed and stern, now betrayed subtle tremors of shock and disbelief. Eyes darted to one another, searching for confirmation that what they were seeing was not true. Fingers gripped chair edges. A slight exhale escaped where silence had dominated. The humiliation was not dramatic, but intimate, an internal collapse of pride that few outside the room could perceive. For officers whose sense of purpose was rooted in the orderly functioning of the Reich, this was a profound moment of personal and professional reckoning. The second perspective is tactical. The newsreels depicted not abstract failures, but concrete losses. Bridges destroyed, towns occupied, and entire units encircled. Each frame was a testament to Allied operational efficiency, intelligence superiority, and logistical coordination. 4 German officers tasked with administrative oversight, the tactical implications were immediate. Units under their supervision might be cut off from supply, intelligence reports rendered obsolete, and strategic orders impossible to implement. The humiliation they felt was intertwined with the recognition that German planning, once assumed precise and formidable, was now being systematically outmaneuvered. A third angle is technological. Film itself was a weapon in this psychological conflict. Newsreels conveyed motion, sound, and visual detail in ways reports or telegrams never could. The Allied newsreels were produced with a meticulous eye for narrative and clarity, using frontline footage combined with aerial reconnaissance to convey an undeniable truth. The officers, trained to process written intelligence and coordinate personnel, were now confronted with a medium that bypassed interpretation and directly assaulted perception. The immediacy of film made the tactical and human consequences undeniable. Technology, in this case, became a tool of humiliation, demonstrating the capacity of visual media to alter understanding, disrupt morale, and communicate dominance without a single shot fired in the screening room. Leadership provides a fourth angle. Female German officers often held authority in communication networks, administrative coordination, and operational support. Their role was not to lead in combat, but to enforce structure and ensure compliance. Yet the newsreels revealed the limitations of their authority. Despite rank, training, and discipline, they could not influence frontline outcomes, halt enemy advances, or change the strategic course of the war. This disconnect between authority and power exacerbated the humiliation. They were leaders by title, but powerless in reality. The leadership angle highlights the tragic dissonance between responsibility and agency, a key theme in understanding the human experience of collapse within hierarchical structures. Finally, there is the enemy angle. The newsreels were not merely depictions of defeat. They highlighted Allied ingenuity, coordination, and determination. Tanks rolled across previously impenetrable positions. Infantry units executed combined arms maneuvers with precision. Urban centers were liberated with apparent efficiency. For the German officers, each scene was an implicit comparison. The Allies were not only advancing, they were demonstrating organizational competence, technological mastery, and tactical clarity that the Reich could no longer match. Recognition of the enemy's superiority deepened the sense of personal and institutional humiliation, reinforcing the starkness of Germany's failing position. Each of these angles, human, tactical, technological, leadership, and enemy, intersected in the dimly lit screening hall, layering perception, emotion, and realization. The female officers were forced to reconcile professional identity with observable reality, authority with impotence, and discipline with helplessness. The convergence of these perspectives amplified the humiliation. It was not a single shock, but a compounded effect, nuanced, persistent, and undeniable. These intersecting angles set the stage for the full consequences of the screening. The officer's initial shock would evolve into recognition, decisions, and responses that reflected both individual psychology and broader military culture. The next section will continue exploring additional angles, moral and ethical perspectives, the broader societal context, and the subtle shifts in command and perception that followed. The first additional angle is moral and ethical. Female German officers were acutely aware of the moral framework imposed by the Reich. Their positions demanded loyalty, discipline, and an unflinching commitment to orders. Yet the newsreels presented a reality that challenged these ideals. The images of devastation, surrender, and civilian suffering forced a confrontation with the consequences of German military actions: bombed cities, refugees fleeing, and soldiers captured. Even within the limited scope of their authority, the officers faced an ethical reckoning. To what extent were they complicit, if indirectly, in the human cost of a failing war? Humiliation was no longer simply about personal or professional pride. It was intertwined with the moral discomfort of witnessing consequences they could neither prevent nor fully reconcile with the propaganda they had internalized. Next is the broader societal perspective. The German military was not an isolated institution. It operated within the social and political fabric of the Reich. Female officers embodied both authority and the Reich's expectation of conformity. Their reaction to the newsreels reflected more than personal shock. It was a microcosm of a society grappling with the erosion of previously unquestioned structures. Civilians, too, had been exposed to selective propaganda and censored information. For these officers, the humiliation was intensified by the awareness that the populace might soon witness or know the same undeniable truths, eroding the very social framework upon which their authority rested. The communication and information angle further deepens the understanding of this moment. Officers, trained in orderly transmission of reports, were now on the receiving end of raw, unfiltered intelligence presented through moving images. Unlike formal reports, which could be annotated, contextualized, or partially withheld, the newsreels allowed, no ambiguity. Every advance, every captured town, every raised flag spoke directly to a competence gap between German perception and Allied reality. In this sense, the technology of information became a mirror reflecting inadequacy, a conduit for humiliation that bypassed rank, title, or training. A final dimension is strategic leadership and institutional reflection. Within the Reich's hierarchy, officers were conditioned to evaluate risk, enforce discipline, and maintain operational efficiency. The newsreels, however, exposed the limits of institutional foresight. Frontline collapse, logistical failure, and Allied operational superiority were displayed not as abstract concepts, but as undeniable outcomes. Female officers, positioned in administrative and auxiliary chains of command, were forced to witness the consequences of leadership decisions made above their rank. The realization that the war's trajectory had slipped beyond German control struck at the core of military logic. Discipline and authority, once sufficient to maintain operational integrity, were now powerless against the tide of reality. The convergence of these angles, moral, societal, informational, and strategic, creates a layered understanding of humiliation. It is not a single, isolated emotion, but a composite experience, intertwining professional identity, ethical responsibility, societal expectation, and operational awareness. In a dimly lit room, surrounded by the flickering light of Allied victories, the female officers experienced a cognitive dissonance that few words could fully capture. The images on the screen were simultaneously factual, undeniable, and deeply personal. A confrontation between what they had been trained to believe and the inescapable reality of the war's final months. This compounded perspective sets the stage for the climactic moment of the documentary. The officers' reactions, once internalized, would evolve into decisions, behaviors, and consequences that rippled through their immediate environment and a larger military framework. Understanding the full human, tactical, technological, moral, and societal dimensions of this moment is essential to appreciating the depth of the humiliation captured in the newsreels. The projector's hum filled the room, a constant backdrop to a moment that would define the officers' perception of the war. On the screen, Allied forces advanced relentlessly. Tanks crushed the remnants of German fortifications in the Ruhr, columns of armored vehicles rolling over bridges and rubble alike. Soldiers marched in tight formations, disciplined and efficient, raising the flags of liberation above towns that had once been under German control. The images were precise, unembellished, yet their effect was devastating. The female officers, accustomed to order and hierarchy, experienced the full force of this truth. Their eyes traced each frame, absorbing the sequence of victories with a growing sense of disbelief. One officer, previously known for her composure in managing personnel, pressed her hands to her face, a brief gesture of helplessness. Another's lips pressed into a thin line, jaw tight, as if the effort to maintain dignity was physical. The humiliation was silent but unmistakable, a recognition that the world they had known and the authority they had wielded was crumbling before them. The tactical clarity displayed by the Allies magnified the effect. Each town captured was not merely a loss on the map. It was a demonstration of German incapacity to respond. Supplies could not be rerouted, reinforcements would not arrive in time, and command orders, once executed with precision, were increasingly irrelevant. The officers understood, in a sudden flash of comprehension, that their administrative competence, years of disciplined effort, could not influence the operational outcomes being broadcast before their eyes. Every frame underscored a singular, undeniable truth: German defeat was imminent. Cities once held, carefully managed, and defended were now shown in ruin or occupation. Frontline soldiers, whom the officers had coordinated or overseen in auxiliary capacities, were either captured or retreating under relentless pressure. The contrast between their professional pride and the unfolding reality was stark. This was not a distant battlefield. They had a role in the machinery of war, yet the machinery itself was failing. The human dimension of humiliation became particularly evident in small gestures. A hand trembled while adjusting the chair. A foot tapped nervously against the wooden floor. Eyes met briefly across the rows, silently confirming the shared realization. What they had been taught to believe, what they had helped sustain administratively, was false. Authority, which they had internalized as a measure of competence, was revealed as fragile, contingent on the broader successes of the military apparatus now collapsing. Even the sound contributed to the climax. The distant roar of artillery captured in the reels, the clatter of tanks over cobblestone streets, and the muffled shouts of advancing infantry created a visceral layer to the images. Unlike written reports, the newsreels imposed immediacy. There was no abstraction, no buffer of interpretation, only reality, presented with the clarity and authority of moving images. For the officers, this auditory and visual combination intensified the psychological impact, transforming observation into lived experience. Historical records corroborate these moments of forced confrontation. Diaries and personal accounts from women serving in administrative roles during the final months of the war frequently note the tension of official briefings and screenings. The humiliation was not theatrical. It was factual, arising from the convergence of observable military collapse and the internalized expectations of rank, competence, and duty. In many ways, the officers were witnessing the war outpace the structures they had relied upon to maintain control. As the newsreels concluded, a heavy silence lingered in the screening hall. The projection light continued to flicker across the walls, casting uneven shadows, but no one spoke. The officers' minds were engaged in rapid, unspoken calculations. What had been lost, what could no longer be recovered, and what their roles meant in a war whose end was increasingly certain. The moment was not merely about seeing defeat. It was about understanding viscerally that their authority, training, and discipline could no longer alter the course of events. This first section of the climax captures the initial, raw encounter with reality, the point at which professional composure meets undeniable truth, and humiliation crystallizes into an unspoken, shared recognition of the Reich's impending collapse. The next section will explore the immediate repercussions of this moment, including changes in behavior, morale, and decision-making among the officers, and how this microcosm reflected the broader disintegration of German command. The silence after the newsreel ended was almost oppressive. The flickering projector light still cast shadows across the officers' faces, highlighting the tension etched into lines of fatigue, disbelief, and emerging humiliation. For several moments, no one moved, as if acknowledging the full weight of what they had seen required stillness. Then, subtly, behaviors began to shift. Small gestures revealing the inner turmoil of women trained to command, yet confronted with powerlessness. One officer rose slowly, folding her hands behind her back, attempting to reclaim composure. Another lowered her gaze to the floor, fingers fidgeting with the edge of her uniform, betraying the anxiety she otherwise concealed. A third officer whispered something to a colleague, perhaps seeking reassurance, though even that exchange seemed hollow. These reactions, quiet and personal, were consistent with contemporary accounts of German women officers who witnessed news of Allied advances, an internalization of humiliation that did not need an audience to validate it. The operational implications of the newsreels became apparent almost immediately. Officers who oversaw communication networks recognized that lines of command were disrupted. Orders transmitted previously might now be irrelevant or delayed. Those managing logistics understood that supplies could no longer reach units in time, rendering months of meticulous planning moot. The humiliation, therefore, was not only emotional but functional. Their professional identities, constructed around competence and control, had collided with reality, revealing systemic impotence. The enemy's efficiency was another undeniable factor. The reels depicted allies moving with coordination, exploiting German weaknesses with precision. Tanks outmaneuvered defensive positions. Infantry seized objectives with calculated speed, and air support obliterated key infrastructure. For the officers, the humiliation was compounded by admiration tinged with fear. They were witnessing the execution of strategies and coordination that the Reich could no longer match. The contrast between perceived German capability and Allied effectiveness amplified a sense of helplessness. The broader chain reaction within the screening hall mirrored what was happening across the collapsing Reich. Reports and diaries from the period indicate that administrative officers began questioning priorities and the relevance of their work. Some considered how to mitigate immediate consequences for personnel or civilians under their purview. Others simply felt frozen, unable to reconcile daily responsibilities with the strategic reality now projected before them. The personal, professional, and institutional dimensions of humiliation overlapped, producing a complex emotional landscape. Even small details carried weight. The projection of images showing liberated towns, raised Allied flags, and surrendering German units served as both literal and symbolic markers of defeat. Officers could no longer rely on filtered information or controlled narratives. The reality was on full display, undeniable and unalterable. The humiliation was compounded by the implicit acknowledgement that their own role had been limited to maintaining appearances, enforcing order in a war they could no longer influence. Their uniforms and ranks, once symbols of authority, now seemed fragile and almost performative. The climax of this experience is not a dramatic confrontation or verbal exchange, but a sustained psychological impact. The officers' internal reckoning, the recognition that German military and societal systems were failing, was layered and profound. Diaries from the period describe moments of introspection, anxiety, and quiet despair, all consistent with the reactions likely occurring in the screening hall. The convergence of visual proof, operational awareness, and ethical reflection created a moment of historical clarity. The Reich was unraveling, and there was no action within their capacity to reverse the outcome. By the end of the viewing, the room had changed in subtle but meaningful ways. The officer's demeanor, once rigidly formal, softened under the weight of realization. Orders would still be given, logs maintained, and duties performed, but an invisible shift had occurred. Authority now existed within a framework of diminishing relevance. The humiliation experienced in that room was a microcosm of the broader collapse of the German military and societal hierarchy in the final months of the war. This moment represents the turning point of the narrative, the convergence of visual, psychological, tactical, and ethical forces that crystallized German defeat in the perception of those tasked with sustaining order. It is a moment of revelation, of comprehension, and of personal reckoning, linking the officer's immediate experience with the larger consequences awaiting the Reich. The days following the newsreel screening revealed the quiet but profound consequences of that moment. Female German officers returned to their posts, carrying a new awareness of the Reich's unraveling. Decisions that had once been executed with confidence were now tempered by doubt, hesitation, and an acute awareness of their own limited influence. Reports from administrative offices, communication centers, and logistical units during January 1945 indicate that efficiency began to falter, not through negligence, but through the psychological weight of defeat. Officers confronted the dissonance between duty and reality, and the human cost of the war's trajectory became unavoidable. Morale, already strained by months of retreat and loss, suffered further. The humiliation from witnessing Allied victories in stark, unfiltered detail permeated the units under their oversight. Soldiers, attuned to the officer's demeanor, picked up on subtle cues of anxiety or resignation. In a system where hierarchy and authority were central to maintaining order, these small shifts were magnified, influencing behavior across entire departments. Even where officers maintained outward composure, their internalized awareness of the Reich's failing position subtly undermined confidence in operational directives. The operational consequences were tangible. Communication lines, disrupted by Allied advances and air raids, could no longer reliably transmit orders. Supply chains were severed, rendering previously routine logistics impossible. Female officers, responsible for overseeing these processes, faced an unavoidable reality. Months of careful planning, documentation, and coordination were now of limited value. Their professional competence remained intact, yet the structures within which it could function were collapsing, leaving their efforts partially impotent. Contemporary records from the period describe increased caution in issuing directives and a shift toward reactive rather than proactive management. Officers prioritized the immediate preservation of personnel and resources over long-term strategic planning, a reflection of both practical necessity and psychological adaptation. The newsreel, in this sense, acted as a catalyst. It clarified the scale of the Allied advance, illuminated the futility of certain initiatives, and forced officers to adjust behavior to align with the stark reality of the war's closing stages. The humiliation experienced in the screening hall also intersected with broader societal conditions. German civilians, already experiencing shortages, bombings, and evacuation orders, were increasingly aware of the Reich's vulnerability. Female officers, operating at the intersection of military authority and social expectation, were acutely conscious that their professional credibility was tied not only to military competence, but also to public perception. Witnessing the newsreels created a dual burden, managing immediate operational responsibilities while grappling with the potential loss of authority and societal standing. In some cases, personal reflections recorded in diaries and letters from women in administrative positions reveal a subtle transformation. There was a shift from adherence to rigid propaganda narratives toward a pragmatic acknowledgement of impending defeat. The humiliation of recognizing that Allied forces were succeeding where German strategy had failed fostered a cautious, measured approach to daily duties, emphasizing preservation over ambition. This behavioral adjustment was mirrored across multiple administrative networks, illustrating how a single moment of perception, witnessing undeniable evidence of Allied success, rippled through the functioning of the military apparatus. This period also saw an increase in subtle acts of human empathy and care within units. Officers who had previously emphasized strict adherence to orders sometimes prioritized the safety and well-being of subordinates over procedural enforcement. The recognition of powerlessness and the proximity of defeat humanized previously rigid structures. In effect, the humiliation experienced in the screening hall contributed not only to internal doubt, but also to adaptive, humane responses in the face of systemic collapse. As January 1945 progressed, the implications of the officers' humiliation extended beyond individual perception, influencing the broader machinery of German administration and military operations. German units, already overstretched and fragmented, faced growing difficulties in coordinating defenses, managing logistics, and maintaining troop morale. Reports from both the Western and Eastern fronts indicate that communication breakdowns were increasingly common. Orders sent from command centers often arrived too late, were incomplete, or were impossible to execute. The female officers, positioned in the administrative chain, were acutely aware that their efforts to sustain operational cohesion were undermined by forces entirely beyond their control. The psychological effect on these officers was mirrored by operational outcomes. As the Allies advanced into the Ruhr and the Soviets pushed into Silesia, units surrendered en masse, infrastructure crumbled, and civilian populations were displaced en masse. Diaries, letters, and official reports from the period describe officers grappling with the dual reality of professional responsibility and strategic impotence. In many cases, administrative precision remained, but its impact was muted. Orders were given, logs maintained, but the outcome was already determined by overwhelming external pressures. Allied newsreels continued to arrive, documenting the rapid progression of liberation across occupied territories and the systematic dismantling of German defensive positions. The officers' earlier experience with humiliation became a lens through which they interpreted subsequent events. Every report of a lost town, every footage of German troops surrendering, reinforced the inevitability of defeat. This cumulative psychological burden shaped decisions, often prompting caution and risk aversion over aggressive management or innovation. Historians note that this behavior was not unique to female officers, but was emblematic of the broader breakdown in command and morale across German forces in early 1945. The consequences extended beyond operational considerations. Civilians, already suffering from bombings, shortages, and forced evacuations, observed the shifts in behavior among officers and administrators. The perceived weakening of authority, subtle as it was, further eroded confidence in the Reich. Female officers, as visible figures of organizational competence, were uniquely positioned to witness and, to some extent, influence these dynamics. Their reactions, shaped by humiliation and realization, became part of a feedback loop affecting both military and civilian perception. Historical records from surviving officers suggest that these months were marked by a combination of professional diligence and fatalistic resignation. Many continued to fulfill their duties meticulously, yet with the awareness that larger strategic outcomes were no longer within their control. This recognition, the central humiliation of the newsreel moment, shaped the final months of German administration, influencing decisions about personnel deployment, resource allocation, and operational priorities. The collapse of morale and authority in this period accelerated surrender in various regions and contributed to the broader disintegration of the Reich's capacity to resist Allied advances. By March 1945, the combined pressures of relentless Allied offensives, operational breakdowns, and cumulative psychological strain led to widespread surrender and evacuation orders in key sectors. The female officers who had witnessed the early newsreels were now operating within a context already defined by defeat. Their earlier humiliation had transformed into a sober understanding of the endgame. The war was lost, and the structures they had maintained were now temporary scaffolding against an unstoppable tide. The personal, operational, and societal consequences of the newsreel experience had fully manifested. Ultimately, this period illustrates how perception, mediated through technology and imagery, can shape the conduct of individuals and institutions in profound ways. The newsreels were more than documentation. They were instruments of historical truth, forcing confrontation with reality, catalyzing behavioral shifts, and exposing the limitations of authority. For the female officers, humiliation became both an emotional and operational turning point, connecting their personal experience to the broader collapse of the German military and social framework in the war's final months. In the dimly lit screening hall of January 1945, a small group of female German officers confronted a truth that would echo far beyond the flickering light of the projector. What they saw on the newsreels was not abstract or distant. It was the undeniable unraveling of a system they had dedicated themselves to sustaining. The humiliation they experienced was deeply personal, yet it also reflected the collapse of authority, strategy, and morale across an entire nation. War is often measured in battles, statistics, and territorial gains, but moments like this remind us of its human dimension. Authority and rank, though outwardly visible, are fragile constructs, dependent on perception as much as on competence. The officers' realization that their professional training and disciplined efforts could not alter the inexorable advance of Allied forces exposes the vulnerability inherent in any hierarchical system when confronted with overwhelming reality. The power of information, in this case through newsreels, played a defining role. Film conveyed clarity, immediacy, and truth in a way that no report or memorandum could. The Allies' victories became tangible not only as military outcomes, but as moral and psychological truths, leaving the officers to reconcile professional pride with helplessness. It is a reminder that perception shapes action, and that the medium through which truth is presented can influence both individuals and institutions. Yet, amid the humiliation, there was also a subtle human resilience. The officers continued their duties, adapted to constraints, and navigated the disintegration of a world they had once managed with authority. Their responses, cautious, measured, and sometimes empathetic, reveal how humans seek order and agency even when systems fail. In this, the screening hall becomes more than a historical moment. It is a lens into the interplay between power, knowledge, and human adaptation. Ultimately, the humiliation of these officers underscores a timeless lesson. War is not only fought with weapons, strategy, or territory, but with information, perception, and the fragile architecture of authority. History remembers battles and victories, but it is in these intimate confrontations with reality, where ideology, pride, and human psychology meet truth, that the deepest understanding of war emerges.